seconds.
In the skies above northern England, RAF Tornado bombers are searching for targets.
Missile launch tracking.
They will soon be doing this for real in Afghanistan. They will have to make life or death decisions in seconds.
Sky 2-1, we're level now.
10,000 feet above the North Sea, a trio of RAF Tornadoes are on the hunt. In the months to come, the crews of these planes will be deployed to Afghanistan to support ground forces in the region. In recent weeks, they have been practicing intensively, and the BBC has been allowed special access to their preparations, both in the air and on the ground.
Those Tornadoes are based here at RAF Marham in Norfolk. This is a busy air station with 4 flying squadrons in total, and a lot of hard work goes on here keeping dozens of planes operational. Now these are Tornado GR4s. They are bombers, but in Afghanistan they'll be used for reconnaissance and providing air cover for troops on the ground.
All those skills are being tested here on a daily basis, with sortie after sortie taking off. On the exercise we're following, we will see how they do it. But first, let's take a closer look at the aircraft they're flying.
This is a Tornado GR4, one of our jets on 9 Squadron. Currently, although it's one that we use for training at the moment, it's essentially the same as the aircraft that we use on ops in Afghanistan. Starting from the front here, then this is the radome. There's a couple of radars in here, one that does ground mapping, which is what we used to use for weapon aiming, and one that does terrain following, so it looks ahead of the aircraft. We can link it with the autopilot and fly hands off at 200 feet in cloud at night. And up here, that's the refueling probe. This is what we use when we air-to-air refuel. So at the moment, it's nicely sunk into its housing. When we find the tanker that we're going to refuel from, then a flick of the switch and the probe comes out like that, and we'll fly that into the basket and take fuel on. You can see here the jet's being refueled at the moment on the ground, so it goes into a hole in the side of the aircraft. This takes about 10-15 minutes. When you're taking fuel on in the air, then 5 to 10 minutes is more like what you do. I'm sat on an ejection seat, which is obviously safe at the moment, and then in the front we've got the standard pilot's tools of a control column or a stick, throttles down here, and flight instruments, which are on the left-hand side down here. But all my flight instruments are replicated in a head-up display, which stops me from having to look into the cockpit all the time.
Now the Tornado, of course, is a 2-crew aircraft. This is the back seat, this is where the navigator would sit, and Wing Commander Nick Hay is the commanding officer of 9 Squadron, who are deploying to Afghanistan early in 2010. Nick, just tell us a little bit about what happens in back here.
Well, the navigation pretty much in this day and age is done by the inertial navigation unit and GPS, so most of our job is actually controlling the weapons systems and the countermeasures to any surface-to-air missiles. Primarily, right in front of you, you have a moving map. That will show me where I am. On top of that, I can have the radar, so if I need to update the system, then I can use the radar, although in this day and age, we're very reliant on the GPS. On the right and on the left-hand side are 2 TV screens, one of which can be replicated in the front cockpit for the pilot. And generally, we fly around with some navigational information on here, and on the left-hand side, we'll have the image of the targeting pod. So anything where we slew up to, so if we're doing some reconnaissance in support of the ground patrols, we can actually put it on here.
So you have to be a bit of a whiz with technology to sit in the back?
Obviously not, because I can do it, but yeah. Certainly, when it's replicating in a Typhoon, all of this stuff is also in the front seat as well. But it's fairly simple to use.
And so when you're flying, you're spending most of your time looking at all this. The person in the front's worrying about where you're going?
He's in charge, making sure we don't hit anything in the air, unmanned air vehicles or any other aircraft flying around. We shouldn't really be spending all our time in there, but you can find when you're actually on a task supporting the guys on the ground that actually, you need to pay 95% of your attention needs to be on where your pod is looking to provide them with their situational awareness.
9 Squadron has just celebrated its 95th anniversary. In World War II, they flew Wellingtons and Lancasters and were responsible for sinking the German battleship Tirpitz in 1944. Then, during the Cold War, they carried Britain's nuclear deterrent in Vulcan bombers. But their modern-day role is not vastly different to what they did in their earliest days.
The first role that it actually did was reconnaissance in support of patrols on the ground and a bit of artillery spotting. So there is a distinctive link between 1914 and what we're going to do in 2009. The basic tenets haven't changed. What has changed is the technology of what we do it. So instead of being at low level and being potentially threatened by rifles and artillery, we can now sit above a lot of that and then use our sensors to stand off from afar. And you know, we can see guys with rifles, and we can see guys virtually with guns in their hands, which you couldn't have seen perhaps in 1914.
But today's RAF bomber squadrons are armed with an array of precision weapons. They are lethally effective, but the ethos of those tasked to deliver them is that all force must be proportionate and that civilian casualties have to be avoided.
Ultimately, I'm trying to deliver an effect for the forces on the ground that are in trouble or for whatever they need. My other major consideration is to minimise any collateral damage. Once I've got all that information together, then I'm going to take into account what he wants and then try and deliver it with the minimal force initially, and if ultimately that will work up to the point of dropping a bomb if required. But that's our last-ditch method.
A small pass high up in the mountains is the place where the bombs fell. Afghan investigators said 47 civilians had died, most of them women and children, on their way to a wedding celebration. The US forces initially said they were insurgents, but they don't wear wedding dress material.
And this is exactly the sort of tragedy that Allied air forces want to avoid. It may be termed collateral damage in military speak, but everyone knows it translates to innocent civilians.
I was waiting for the wedding party when I heard the bomb. I rushed to the mountain, he said, describing the terrible scene of the dying and the injured scattered across the mountainside.
Those responsible for delivering force from the air know these terrible incidents do nothing to win hearts and minds. And no RAF pilot wants to be the first of their country's air force to make such a mistake.
We try and do it through a number of ways. One is the training that we do with the troops before we deploy, so the crews have got the best possible skill sets available to make sure they do the right thing. But actually it comes down to them making the right decision in the air, and it's quite a difficult job to do, because when you have a troop commander calling for an air strike because of the situation they're in, it takes a pretty cool head in the air to make a reasoned judgment as to whether that's the right thing to do. And I know that my crews, if there's any doubt, they won't drop. It's a difficult decision to make sometimes, but for the campaign and for doing the right thing, it is the right decision to make.
Modern technology also allows some bombs to be redirected after they've been dropped by an aircraft. The Ministry of Defence recently released these images from an RAF Harrier jet in Afghanistan. It shows, they say, a vehicle carrying a Taliban leader being targeted by the plane. But just moments before impact, the vehicle pulls up by a group of civilians. Whilst the bomb is still homing in on the pickup, the pilot decides to abort the raid and redirects the bomb to land in the desert nearby.
Now, with reconnaissance being one of the main roles that the Tornadoes are going to be doing in Afghanistan, there's a heavy reliance on technology. And one of the things is known as a Raptor pod, which is on the underside of this aircraft. James, just tell us a little bit about what's in here and what it does.
Yeah, sure. We're actually really proud of the stuff we're doing with this pod at the moment. What it does is it takes images of the ground that we can use to find improvised explosives, look at potential helicopter landing zones, etc., all in support of the land forces in Afghanistan. The beauty of this, though, is that not only does it record loads and loads of imagery, but it also, we have the capability of downloading that imagery whilst we're still airborne. So it makes it almost real time. So the guys on the ground can start looking at those images and start finding improvised explosives as soon as possible. At the same time, when we've landed, then the guys can also download the tape that the images are recorded onto, and they can take that away for analysis as well. So it's a really useful piece of equipment and used an awful lot at the moment in Afghanistan.
And this is how sharp those images from the Raptor pod are. These are just practice pictures taken over the UK.
Just going to zoom into the fuel tanks.
But as well as a picture, They also show heat sources, which in Afghanistan means people and potentially weapons.
It's made a huge difference out in Afghanistan since it deployed with the Tornadoes this summer. It's a much more capable system than anything out there that's gone before, and with it we can support allied nations across the whole of Afghanistan and collect information for them. It is superb imagery. You can see things like patterns on rugs from 20,000 feet and over 20 miles away across the ground. Meaning it's a huge amount of detail identifying who people are and where they're going.
And for the analysts, there is a huge responsibility. Just like the air crews, they have to make life and death decisions.
They're very young and they quite often have to stand up against very, very senior army officers and tell them what's going on. Everyone thinks they can look at imagery and tell what's going on, but in reality you have to be very well trained and very skilled at your job to actually see what's going. An example would be we've had individuals stop artillery fire on groups that somebody thought were insurgents because they noticed that there were actually children among them. It's saying that tiny bit of detail that often works.
Up to 10,000 feet only.
For any mission, the pre-flight briefing is vital. With sorties often involving up to 4 tornadoes, all those involved need to know exactly where they are going and what the day's task is. While the briefing takes place, the ground crews are preparing the aircraft and arming them with dummy weapons for the exercise. A short time later, the Tornadoes are taking off. Their mission is to find targets a few hundred miles away on a military range in a remote part of northern England.
Firepower control 11K.
The planes quickly climb through the clouds to gain altitude for their journey northwards. But there's one important job to be done before they can continue with their mission. Minutes later, about 100 miles further north, the Tornado formation rendezvous with a tanker.
Spawn 200. 2-3.
When they get to Afghanistan, these jets and their crews may have to stay airborne for up to 8 hours. And the only way they can do this is by perfecting the intricate skills of air-to-air refuelling.
When you first start doing it, it's probably the most difficult thing that pilots do. It's completely counterintuitive flying one aeroplane into another aeroplane, because what you have to do is put the probe out on the aircraft and then find the basket on this, essentially what is a big airliner, and then stick your small refueling probe into the airliner's basket and make contact with another aeroplane in the sky. That basket wobbles around a lot with the airflow of the aircraft, and you know, it's very difficult to do. Once you've done it a few times, it becomes more natural, and it doesn't seem as hard. But when you first do it, and I fly with a lot of guys that you know, when they're doing it for the first time, they do find it difficult. But you become used to it. Yeah, it's absolutely vital. We do air-to-air refueling, so you can see it really extends the time we can be out there. And with the fact that we're mostly looking at reconnaissance and essentially being there for cover in case something happens, then the longer you can be available to the land forces, the better. So air-to-air refueling is vital.
Meanwhile, on the ground, close to their eventual target, soldiers are already faced with a scenario they may come up against for real in Afghanistan. Another soldier plays the role of what appears to be a distressed civilian with a wounded companion. But is everything as it appears to be? Are they civilians needing help, or is this a Taliban ambush that could quickly grow into a major incident requiring support from the air?
It's hopefully as seamless and certainly invisible to the guys on the ground. All they need to know is that if they need support from the air, they'll get it very, very quickly. And that reassurance on their part means they can go out there with confidence and make sure is there to support them in whatever means, whether it be a show of force or a medevac.
Travel 22, continue drive.
If air support is needed, a lot of skill goes into making sure the right place is targeted. And here at RAF Spade Adam in the border forests between England and Scotland, mock buildings and tanks have been built to try and make the scenarios as realistic as possible.
The difficult part is the jet's travelling at over 500 miles an hour, you have less than 60, if you're coming in low level, you have less than 60 seconds to talk that jet onto, it might be one person laying an IED onto a road that's in the vicinity of multiple buildings, multiple cars, in and around a civilian population. So a jet travelling on a line of attack, you know, at 500 miles an hour, very limited time to talk him on. So that language has to be very precise, quick and sharp to get him eyes on straight away. So we generally talk about a big picture and then bring him closer and closer and closer down to the exact point we're looking to bring him in on. So it's pretty difficult to get a jet onto that target.
Marham 2-1 flight, Silver 1, go.
Back out over the North Sea, the Tornado force is preparing to break away from its refuelling stage. It's now mission on as they head towards the northeast coast of England and the hilly terrain of the practice range. Alongside them is a Hawk from 100 Squadron at RAF Leeming to allow the BBC to film the exercise. The other pictures are from a camera in the back of one of the Tornadoes. With the refuelling practice taking place at altitude, the formation gradually loses height ahead of making contact with the forward air controllers on the ground.
We will talk to the pilot beforehand, so we'll give him all the information required, and then between the two of us, we'll decide about what munition to use. The pilot is the expert on the munitions. We all have a basic understanding of what each weapon system we could use and the capabilities of such. But between us, for example, if it's a soft skin vehicle, we'll decide what munition to use to to have the effect we require, but also to think about the collateral damages issues that it might use.
The forward air controllers are looking out for the live picture feed from the Tornado's onboard camera. It can be received from up to 30 miles away. When those on the ground are locked on to pictures from the jet, it's known as a handshake.
Agony 16. We're now receiving, or we were receiving a good handshake. Stand by.
A handshake is when you get the picture from the pod, which is essentially the same as the picture that you see when you in the police camera action type videos from the helicopters. That picture is sent directly down to a forward air controller in the Army's laptop, and he can see that same picture. And when he can see that picture, then he tells us he's got a good handshake, and we're talking about the same thing.
The whole process helps verify targets from those close by on the ground, but a bombing run is not necessarily the only course of action.
Ordnance request, initially request a show of force at low level.
A show of force is a low, aggressive flypast. Sometimes a Tornado jet buzzing an area is enough to reduce the threat.
What we essentially do is fly over the top of the target as low and as fast as we can go, so 500-600 knots and 100 feet. And what that does is provides shock value and imminent kind of threat to them of force, and they tend to stop doing what they're doing without us having to actually drop weapons. We've shown it on many occasions that it actually works really well.
So this low-level flying is all part of adapting tactics to combat what the insurgents are doing in Afghanistan.
But you have to understand that the Taliban, of course, try to entice the fight into sort of populated areas, and so to a degree we're having to make sure that we make as many right decisions as we possibly can. And I have to say, the way that we train, the way that we operate, we have a good record.
But when a decision is made to drop a bomb, accuracy is the key.
Sits on the left-hand side of a forward-facing slope.
Left side, forward-facing slope.
The Tornadoes we've been following since takeoff are now skimming over the hilltops as the forward air controllers from the Army talk them onto their target.
Your target is an on-track, single-storey grey ISO container. Sits on the left-hand side of a forward-facing slope.
Left side, forward-facing slope. Splash.
The teamwork and technology pay off with a direct hit. As the Tornadoes fly out of the area, a quick debrief takes place on the radio.
The only things that really come out of it were on the run-ins, we need a clearance. When the guys are talking, they've just got to keep quiet just for a couple of seconds, but the rest of it seemed to work out quite nicely.
Yeah, roger, point taken, we'll to brief that to the guys. If you check out through Spadeadder, make sure your switches are safe, and thanks for your trade.
With the exercise over, the Tornadoes climb away and head for home. A few hundred miles back to the south, this is what it's like to land at RAF Marham.
Just up, down, we are.
But this is not the real thing. It's the flight simulator used intensively by the crews.
69, clear hot, target 4.
This expensive bit of kit can place pilots and navigators virtually anywhere in the world. It's operated by former Tornado aircrew with extensive combat experience.
69, score 10 hits.
Once you're in there, the immersion is total. The optical illusion of the simulator in motion, etc., is complete. And by the time we've loaded them up from down here in the instructor station, by the time they've got tasks to perform, the aircraft's got problems, there's a lot of RT going on, they're getting tasked, the radios are buzzing, then every neuron in their head is engaged, and they've got to get on with it. This is a sort of a representation of the simulator where it's parked on Kandahar Air Base, and this is where the crews will be taking the aircraft from in theatre. I can zoom out on this now, and you can see the airfield beginning to appear, and that is a database representation of Kandahar Air Base. So the crews will taxi from that position, and they will understand the taxi patterns, they'll understand the runway, the direction, the conditions, and the takeoff performance from the aeroplane. We're able to simulate the Met conditions that they're likely to encounter, the terrain, which is obviously totally different from anything they've encountered in the UK, with very high mountains. We're able to simulate the aircraft performance, which changes quite dramatically when you put an airfield up at 3,000 and 4,000 feet above sea level, as opposed to Marham, which is basically at sea level. They come into the simulator and they go away from here slightly chastened in some respects, but at least now they've seen it and they know what to expect.
But the simulator can't familiarise everybody with everything. Engineers will be working on the aircraft 24 hours a day when deployed in difficult desert conditions.
Where we operate from, we try and keep the area as clean as possible, so actually while we're on the aircraft operating area it's not so bad, that's completely dust free. But saying that, everywhere else around the base is like a thin powder that gets onto absolutely everything, so yeah, that is a challenge in itself. But both the guys and girls feel the difference in temperatures during the day. It can be quite warm during the day with the sunshine out there as well, and at night can go down to quite severely negative temperatures. So yeah, it's a challenge for them to bring in enough clothes during the day to be warm and at night to put on the gloves and things to work as well, which makes things awkward.
For families though, the celebrations over the festive period are tinged with anxiety as they plan ahead to deployment.
That's got Daddy's head on it, that is Dad.
Flight Lieutenant Gaz Lewis is one of 9 squadron's engineers and will be leaving behind his wife and 3 children.
We have taken the measures, i.e. the writing the will, and it is sometimes, you know, because you often take stock sometimes and think, could he be the one? Could he, you know, could he be the one that doesn't come back? But you know, if you dwelled on that, then you know you'd be on a downward slide. The way we're thinking at the moment is this is the hardest time, preparing to go. Once he's gone, it's a downhill slide, and he'll be coming home every day. He's away. It's one step closer to him coming home. I mean, I'm an ex-service woman myself. I left the Navy in 2001, and that's exactly it. You know, you join the forces and you take the rough with the smooth, and that's just the way that the service life goes.
Preparation for the deployment has been ongoing for months, with equipment already in place for the arrival of the squadrons from Marham. Maintaining the RAF's reputation for accuracy will soon be down to the split-second decision-making by the personnel who fly, maintain and direct these aircraft. While the political debates continue about the Afghan conflict, Britain's armed forces are at the forefront of implementing government policy. Every one of them knows they have to do their job right, because the political implications if they don't are huge.
It takes a pretty cool head in the air to make a reasoned judgment as to whether that's the right thing to do. And I know that my crews, if there's any doubt, they won't drop.
You join the forces and you take the rough with the smooth, and that's just the way that the service life goes.
still think there is a time and a place for a lady or a gentleman in a cockpit to make a decision. I'd say it is a key component of what the UK, US and other ISAF forces require, which is providing them real-time situational awareness and, if needs be, the ability to engage the enemy should they stop them doing what they're out there to do, which is bring peace to Afghanistan.